England in the early 17th century was a land built on fear. The air itself seemed weighted with suspicion, with whispers of heresy, with the endless clash between faiths that tore through families, parishes, even the walls of Parliament. It was a kingdom scarred by fire, bound in chains, and governed as much by the spectacle of punishment as by the rule of law. To live in those years was to know that justice was not blind nor merciful. It was brutal, deliberate, and performed with the precision of theater. Here, death was not simply an ending, it was ceremony, a ritual stage for the watching multitude, a grim drama in which the condemned became both actor and victim. They were dragged through the mud-strewn streets, bound in ropes, jeered at by crowds that hungered for blood, and upon the scaffold, before the gaze of nobles and peasants alike, the body ceased to belong to the man or woman who had once inhabited it. It belonged instead to the kingdom, and the kingdom demanded a show. Hanging was never meant to be swift. The rope tightened, leaving the traitor dangling half dead, his chest heaving, his face purple with the struggle for air. But mercy was not part of the performance. The noose was only the beginning, for then came the blade, wielded not in haste but in dreadful ceremony. The stomach was cut open, the entrails pulled forth and displayed to the crowd as though truth could be read in the coils of human flesh. And when the body had given all that it could in agony, it was torn further still, quartered, ripped apart by force so that every fragment of treason might be scattered like ashes across the land. This was justice, early Stuart style, written not with ink upon parchment, but with knives upon flesh. It was meant to remind all who looked on. The crown is unassailable, and the price of defiance is not simply death, it is obliteration. A body ruined so that no relic could be venerated, a name condemned so that no memory could endure. The executioner's hand was the quill, the scaffold his parchment, the blood itself the ink in which the law was written. And yet within this theater of horror, the people came willingly. Fathers brought their sons, mothers their daughters. They crowded the squares as if attending a festival, as if the mutilation of a body were as common and as expected as the tolling of a church bell. Some came out of loyalty to cheer the king's justice. Others came out of fear, to remind themselves what fate awaited those who faltered. But many came out of hunger for the spectacle, because pain, when it is not yours, has a way of drawing the eye, and cruelty has a way of dressing itself as entertainment. Imagine the square of London on such a morning, the frost still clinging to the cobblestones, the winter sky heavy and gray, the air filled with the smell of smoke and damp. A scaffold rises above the heads of the crowd like a black tooth against the horizon, and from its shadow the condemned emerges, dragged forward by soldiers, his face pale, his steps faltering, yet every eye is upon him, every breath of the multitude held in anticipation. The drums roll, the priests murmur, and the executioner sharpens his blade with slow, deliberate strokes. Time stretches, cruel and patient, as though the kingdom itself savors what is to come. This was the world into which Guy Fawkes stepped, a world where punishment was not hidden behind stone walls or whispered of in courts of law. It was laid bare, made into ritual, repeated again and again, until it seared itself into the collective memory of England. To rebel against the crown was not merely to gamble one's life. It was to sign in advance the warrant for a death more dreadful than imagination could conjure. To plot against the king was to walk willingly into the jaws of fire, knowing that one's end would be paraded before thousands, that one's suffering would become another act in the theater of death. And yet, in such an age, there were men who dreamed of fire, greater still. Men who believed that if the crown wrote its justice with knives, they would answer with gunpowder. If the kingdom performed its authority upon the scaffold, they would perform their defiance beneath the very stones of Parliament. In this age of gallows and quartering, one man and his companions conceived of a plot so audacious it would echo for centuries. They would not strike with whispers. They would strike with thunder. They would strike with flame. And at the heart of it all stood a soldier, silent in the crowd, watching the scaffold with unreadable eyes. His name was Guy Fawkes. England under King James I was not at peace, though the banners of unity waved above London and the throne projected an image of order. Beneath that surface lay suspicion as thick as the London fog. It was a land fractured by faith, a kingdom where loyalty was measured not by deeds, but by prayers whispered to the right God, in the right church, under the right crown. For Catholics, life had become a slow suffocation. They were fined for their faith, robbed of their right to worship, their sacraments performed in secrecy behind shuttered windows. Their priests moved like shadows through alleyways, hunted and hounded, their very presence punishable by death. For a time, many endured. They endured the whispers of neighbors, the suspicion of magistrates, the constant watch of the crown. They endured until endurance itself began to taste like surrender. Among them, in dimly lit taverns and in hidden chambers, there grew a murmur, small at first, barely more than a breath, but a murmur that carried with it the weight of desperation. And from this silence, from this suffocating life lived in half-light, there rose men who would no longer bow, who would no longer endure. At the center of this storm stood Robert Catesby, charismatic, fervent, a man possessed not by patience, but by fire. To those who gathered in secrecy, he spoke words that cut sharper than any sword. He told them that compromise had failed, that petitions had fallen on deaf ears, that the promises of tolerance made by James I before he ascended the throne had turned to dust. He told them that to live as shadows was not to live at all, and so he whispered the words that would set history ablaze. We will strike at the heart of tyranny. We will destroy Parliament itself. Around him sat men whose names history would remember as both traitors and martyrs. Thomas Percy, Ambrose Rookwood, John Wright, and others whose convictions burned brighter than their fear. They leaned in close, their faces lit by the trembling light of candles, each flame flickering as though the very air recoiled at the enormity of their intent. And in the shadows, silent, steady, there sat one who would become the most infamous of them all. Guy Fawkes. He was no orator, no charismatic leader. Fawkes was a soldier, a man hardened on foreign fields, who had carried the weight of steel and smoke, who had smelled the stench of battle long before he was drawn into this circle. What he brought was not fiery words, but deadly skill. He understood powder, fire, the alchemy of destruction. While others dreamed of vengeance, he knew how to build it, how to give it form, how to transform anger into thunder. Their plan was vast, audacious, unthinkable. Beneath the very stones of Westminster, beneath the throne itself, they would dig a grave not for a man, but for a kingdom. They would tunnel like moles under the halls of power, their hands blistered from earth and stone, their muscles straining in silence. Into that darkness, they would carry barrels not of ale or wine, but of gunpowder. 36 in total, enough to split the heart of London, enough to scatter the king, his ministers, his court into dust and ruin. One spark. That was all it would take. One spark to erase a monarch, to silence the voices that condemned their faith, to tear down the edifice of persecution built over decades. One spark to reshape the kingdom, to write a New England in the language of fire and blood. And yet in their minds this was not madness. To them it was justice. To them it was salvation. They did not dream of crowns for themselves, nor of riches stolen from others. They dreamed of a faith restored, of altars rebuilt, of children raised without fear of the priest's knock at the door. They dreamed of an England where a man might bend his knee in prayer without dread of chains. Theirs was not a conspiracy born of greed, but of desperation, the desperation of men who had seen every door closed, every plea rejected, every hope extinguished. History would call them traitors, and perhaps rightly so. But in that candlelit room, they called themselves deliverers, and though their number was small, though their faces were drawn tight with anxiety, their plan was as vast as kingdoms and as reckless as flame. Thus was the seed planted, a seed watered not with patience but with rage, a seed buried in the dark earth beneath Parliament, waiting for the touch of fire. And in the silence of that room, as the others whispered, it was Guy Fawkes who remained still, his eyes fixed on the trembling flame of the candle. In its flicker, he saw not fear, but purpose. He knew what he was chosen to do. For while others would talk of vengeance, it would be his hand that struck the match. Beneath the polished stones of Westminster, a different kingdom was taking shape. Not a kingdom of law or ceremony, but of earth, sweat, and silence. The conspirators had traded the open air for tunnels, their world reduced to shadows and dust. Each swing of the shovel was a heartbeat of defiance. Each clump of soil carried away a step deeper into treason. The walls pressed close, damp with centuries of secrets, and the lantern light danced across faces streaked with grime. Breath rose in pale clouds, merging with the smoke of tallow candles, a reminder of the thin line between light and darkness. In this hidden underworld, the plan gained weight and form. They hauled barrels down narrow passages, barrels that clattered like drums of destiny. But these were no containers of wine, no stores of ale for the king's feasts. They held a far darker promise. Gunpowder, measured not in ounces, but in thunder. 36 barrels, stacked with care, veiled beneath timber and straw. Enough to split stone, to shatter pillars, to send the very chamber of Parliament skyward in an eruption of judgment. It was a vision at once terrifying and intoxicating. The king upon his throne, the lords in their robes, the ministers at his side, all reduced in an instant to smoke and ruin. No petition could accomplish this. No prayer could summon it. Only fire, only the roar of powder igniting beneath their feet. And at the heart of it all stood Guy Fawkes. To the others, he was no mere accomplice, but the hand of the plot itself, the soldier, the expert, the man who had carried steel for Spain and knelt beside cannons in Flanders. He alone knew the true voice of fire. He alone had lived within its thunder. Where others dreamed of vengeance, he prepared for it. Where others doubted, he steadied himself in silence. The whispers carried through the tunnel, soft but weighted. When the king arrives, you will be waiting, Guy. It was less instruction than benediction, as though the fate of the realm could be entrusted to no other. And his reply was steady, almost cold. I will not fail. It was not bravado. It was conviction. For Fawkes knew what failure meant, knew it in the scars of war, in the broken bodies of comrades, in the cruel spectacles of English justice. He had seen death enough times to fear it no longer. If fire was to be the language of change, he was willing to speak it, even if it consumed him in the act. Above, the city carried on in ignorance. Merchants shouted in the markets, children played in the alleys, bells rang from the steeples. None knew that beneath their feet, a fuse was being prepared that could rewrite England itself. Each day brought the conspirators closer to their chosen hour, the 5th of November. The date loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, inevitable, swelling with every passing moment. The tension grew unbearable. Every knock at the door seemed a warning, every shifting shadow a spy. Yet still they dug, still they rolled the barrels, still they whispered in the damp. They were no longer men of flesh and doubt. They had become keepers of fire, guardians of a secret that, once revealed, could never be contained. The powder slept beneath the Parliament's very foundations, silent, patient, awaiting only a hand and a spark. And at its side, through the long hours of watch, stood Guy Fawkes. His lantern glowed dim in the dark, his eyes steady, his breath calm. He had sworn to ignite a war at home, and the vow was etched into his bones. All that remained was time, and time, like the powder itself, was running out. Great fires, no matter how carefully kindled, often betray themselves in smoke. And so it was with the Gunpowder Plot. The conspirators had labored in silence, swearing their oaths in candlelit rooms, stacking powder in the belly of Parliament. Yet silence is fragile, and secrets are treacherous things. Somewhere between fear and loyalty, a hand wavered, and into the darkness slipped a letter, unsigned, mysterious, like a ghostly whisper meant to save one life while condemning many others. It arrived at the hands of Lord Monteagle, a noble with friends in high places and a conscience not entirely clouded. The letter warned in veiled words of a great calamity soon to befall the Parliament. Its phrasing was cautious, but its meaning was unmistakable. Do not be present when the king and his court assemble, for doom waits beneath the floor. In that moment, suspicion leapt like wildfire. Whispers carried the news through the corridors of power. The message reached the king himself, James I, who had worn the crown for only a short while, yet already understood the treachery that simmered within his realm. He read the words with furrowed brow, and though many counseled caution, his instincts sharpened like a blade. He knew the language of plots, the riddles of betrayal, and in these lines he smelled the acrid stench of gunpowder. Fear surged through Westminster. The palace that had once echoed with pomp now shivered with dread. Guards doubled their watch. Torches lit the night. Boots echoed in hurried patrols. Every shadow seemed a threat, every creak of timber a warning. The conspirators, who had once moved in secret confidence, now felt the walls closing in. Time, once their ally, had turned against them. Beneath the Parliament, in the damp cellar where earth met stone, Guy Fawkes kept his vigil. Around him lay the barrels, silent, brooding, filled with a power that could topple a kingdom. In his hand flickered the light of a lantern, small yet potent, as though it alone could decide the fate of nations. He was calm, outwardly unshaken, the soldier who had sworn not to fail. Yet above his head, footsteps drew nearer, and in the halls of power the letter was already tightening the noose. The king ordered a search. Torchlight spilled into stairways. Guards moved with rifles in hand, their faces taut with urgency. They descended step by step, guided by rumor and fear, until the air grew heavy with the scent of earth and dust. There in the dark, they found him. Guy Fawkes did not flee. He stood his ground, his figure framed by the lantern's glow, his eyes reflecting both defiance and inevitability. The powder lay at his feet, 36 barrels of thunder waiting only for his touch. The guards raised their weapons. The cellar erupted in shouts, the clash of steel against resistance. For a moment, it seemed the spark might yet ignite, that history itself teetered on the edge of fire. But the hand that had prepared for months was seized in seconds. Fawkes was dragged from the shadows, his lantern wrenched away, his body forced down among the very barrels he had sworn to light. He was captured not as a soldier in battle, but as a criminal in ambush, undone not by strength of arms, but by the betrayal of words on paper. Thus the great plot unraveled, not with an explosion, but with the faint scratching of a quill. One letter had undone what months of silence and secrecy had built. One morning had toppled the vision of fire, and so, on that night, Guy Fawkes was led from the cellar in chains, the powder untouched, the dream of thunder extinguished. He had been caught with the powder at his feet, a single spark away from history. The Tower of London had always been more than stone and iron. It was the beating heart of cruelty itself, where mercy came only in whispers, and where pain became the language of truth. Its walls carried centuries of screams, etched into mortar and bone, and now they welcomed a new prisoner, Guy Fawkes. His name would outlive even the stones, but first the tower would strip him bare. They dragged him in chains across the damp flagstones, his boots slipping on the slime of centuries. The chamber of torment yawned open, lit by torchlight that revealed not tools but instruments of ritual agony. In the center crouched the rack, a beast of wood and rope, its frame blackened by the sweat and blood of countless victims. The guards bound Fawkes, each limb lashed fast, and then the wheels turned. Slowly, deliberately, the ropes tightened, pulling his body apart inch by inch, seeking to unmake the soldier he had once been. The creak of timber mingled with the wet tearing of sinew. Joints bulged, then tore free of their sockets. Muscles snapped like bowstrings. Pain lanced through him, white and merciless, a fire that spread beyond flesh into the marrow of his being. Still the questions came. Names, conspirators, secrets. And still his mouth refused to open. Silence was his last battlefield, and he clung to it with the stubborn courage of a man who knew that words would damn not just himself, but his brothers. Yet the rack was only the beginning. When silence endured, they brought forth the manacles, iron cuffs designed not to restrain, but to maim. Suspended by the wrists, his shoulders wrenched high, his own weight tore the body down. Tendons frayed, cartilage shredded, his arms stretched until the sockets wept, the chains cut into flesh, grinding against bone, while his toes clawed uselessly at the void beneath him. Hours turned into days, every heartbeat another hammer of torment. Still he resisted, so they turned to subtler cruelties. They pressed wedges of iron between his shins, tightening them until the bones themselves shrieked with cracks. They forced pins beneath fingernails, watching blood well and drip. They starved him, deprived him of sleep, plunging his mind into fever. In the cold hours before dawn, they would bring flame close, torches searing skin, the hiss of burning flesh filling the chamber like incense at a dark mass. The smoke of his body mingled with the damp air, choking, suffocating, yet still no confession crossed his lips. Every torment was an invitation to betrayal. Every lash of rope, every twist of iron was a chance to surrender. But Fawkes chose the torment rather than the treachery. His silence grew heavier than iron, more defiant than the rack itself. He became less man than ruin, muscles shredded, joints shattered, ribs cracked and bruised by the boots of his tormentors. When they finally released him from the manacles, he crumpled to the floor, a shadow of the figure who had once carried powder and steel. And yet, even ruined, he denied them the satisfaction of their harvest. They had sought to carve confession from his body, but all they reaped was silence. In that silence lay the last ember of defiance, burning faint but unquenchable. At last, broken but unbowed, they dragged him to trial. The verdict was a formality as inevitable as the sunrise. Treason had only one answer: death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. The words rolled from the judge's lips like scripture, a liturgy of vengeance disguised as law. The day was set, January 31st, 1606. A scaffold rose at Westminster, black against the pale winter sky. The crowd pressed close, eager for the theater of destruction, children perched on shoulders, women elbowing for a glimpse, men jeering at the condemned. Fawkes was brought forth, little more than a husk of bone and pain, yet his eyes still flickered with the faintest spark. Step by step, he climbed the gallows ladder. The mob bayed, the drums rolled, the hangman readied his rope. They hungered for the spectacle of entrails, for the slow butchery of quartering. But Fawkes even now claimed one final act. He gathered what strength remained, bent knees ruined by torment, and hurled himself from the ladder. The snap was final. In that single heartbeat, he robbed his captors of their theater, denying them the mutilation they had prepared. No knives would carve his belly open before the crowd. No ropes would tear him limb from limb. His leap was his last rebellion, a man choosing his own end rather than surrendering it to cruelty. Thus ended Guy Fawkes, torn by torture, condemned by law, yet unbroken in the moment that mattered most. His body lay lifeless, but his silence, his refusal, his leap, these outlasted the blade and the rope. His flesh perished, but his legend endured, echoing through centuries as proof that even the most merciless engines of torment cannot fully conquer the will of a man who refuses to break. The Gunpowder Plot had failed. The powder never roared, the throne never trembled, and the king remained untouched upon his seat. Its architects were hunted down, broken, scattered like ash upon the wind. Their names were etched into the ledgers of treason, their bodies into the soil of shame. By the measure of kings and courts, the plot had been extinguished, its fire smothered before it ever truly began. And yet, history is not written only by victors. Sometimes it is carried by whispers, preserved in shadows, kept alive by memory more stubborn than law. In the very failure of the plot lay its strange triumph, for Guy Fawkes did not vanish into silence. Though his body was destroyed, his name endured. To the crown he was forever traitor, a symbol of rebellion crushed beneath royal power. But to the people, those who gathered in markets, who told stories by firelight, who longed for freedom even when they did not dare speak of it, he became something else, a figure who would not fade, a name that burned across centuries. In the years that followed, the monarchy sought to bind the memory to obedience. Each November, bonfires were lit in England, not to honor but to condemn. The people gathered to throw his likeness into the flames, to watch effigies of Guy Fawkes consumed in fire. Children laughed, torches blazed, and fireworks cracked across the sky. It was meant as a warning, a yearly reminder of the fate that awaited those who defied the crown. But fire is a difficult servant, and memory is not so easily controlled. What began as condemnation became something else, a ritual of remembrance that carried within it a trace of admiration. To some, he was the traitor who nearly unmade a kingdom. To others, he was the man who dared, who struck at the heart of tyranny with nothing but powder, steel, and resolve. Each crackle of the bonfire echoed with contradiction, each burst of flame, both curse and celebration. And so the centuries turned, yet the fire remained. In villages and cities, flames lit the night sky every November. Children carried lanterns, their faces painted by sparks. Old songs were sung, verses recited. Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. The rhyme, once a warning, became instead a chant of memory, refusing to let the name die. Time only deepened the paradox. As the centuries shifted, as empires rose and fell, Guy Fawkes did not vanish into the dust of forgotten traitors. Instead, his face emerged anew, in art, in story, in the mask that would become an icon. That long-nosed visage, lifted from the shadows of history, came to stand for defiance itself. Across the world, in streets far from London, it was worn not to honor treason, but to embody resistance, to challenge power, to say in silence what could not be said in words. Thus, the man who failed to ignite his barrels succeeded in igniting something far greater, an enduring symbol. His flame was not the fire of destruction, but the fire of memory carried forward in each generation that lit its bonfire and watched sparks drift into the cold November sky. Every year, fire returns to England, leaping against the darkness, roaring into the heavens. It is a warning. It is a remembrance. It is, in its strange way, a celebration. Guy Fawkes did not burn the kingdom, but he lit a flame that time has never quenched. And as the embers glow, as the smoke curls upward, his story remains. A shadow, a spark, a reminder that even in failure, some names burn forever.